Does bigger always mean better? Even though I've been shooting on full-frame cameras professionally for years, I have still relied heavily on my APS-C sized Sony a6500 for most of my dark sky time lapses and travel photography. And many of you already know what this form factor can do for your lens budget and packing weight. Just a couple summers ago, Sony released a significant successor in their APS-C line, the a6700. So I had to ask myself, does this new model finally justify a permanent upgrade? The only way to find out is in a head-to-head shootout. Low-light landscape photography has been a focus of the tests on this channel, and we're going to dig deep into those capabilities while also exploring all the reasons why I chose a camera in this product line to begin with. The a6500 was released in November of 2016 and has been my primary personal camera since late 2018. It features a 24-megapixel sensor and is commonly found on the used market for under $600. As mentioned, the new a6700 was released in July of 2023, and while the sensor size remains virtually the same, this model captures images at 26 megapixels. At the time of this recording, it ships for around $1,400. With each in hand, a few differences do jump right out. The newer a6700 is noticeably bigger, but it strangely doesn't feel heavier even though it actually does have a few grams on its predecessor. Unlike the a6500, it does not have an included flash, but I gotta be honest, in the 6 years that I've owned it, I don't think I've ever used it once. It always seemed too small and close to the body to have been effective. And a similar thing could be said of some of the other features that have gone missing. I initially thought that it was unfortunate that the panorama feature was completely removed, but I must admit, I haven't tested it out even once, since stitching images in Adobe is relatively easy. You'll also notice that scene is no longer on the dial, but the features have just been moved into the auto mode. Additionally, the AEL switch is gone, though I almost never moved it from the focus toggle position. The a6700 does add this front dial, not present on the earlier model, and this dedicated photo-video mode switch. I think overall that is a convenience, but it might take a little getting used to. What I don't think I may ever get used to is this updated on-off switch placement. This is definitely not natural to how you hold the camera and was a constant annoyance during testing. Every other Sony model has this right, but for some reason they had to change it on this one. That may be the only drawback in the new build, but the advantages stack up quickly. I never liked the placement of this recording button on the a6500, such an inconvenience and hassle. Swapping it for a programmable C button was a smart move. The new placement feels very intuitive. And who can argue with moving the SD card slot from the battery compartment to a much smarter dedicated location on the side? Speaking of battery, the a6700 takes the standard Z battery that a growing list of Sony cameras all accept now, a major plus for this newer model. To top it all off, the LCD is now on a swivel, giving you much more flexibility and the option to protect the screen when not in use. While I genuinely have babied my a6500, it still shows that it has been through it. At a glance, you really do have to give it to the a6700. I'm irked by the unforced error of the modified power switch placement, but everything else makes this newer model a much better choice on build. And that may also be true for the internals. The a6700 features a wider ISO range as well as a faster shutter, giving you more control over your scenes. While they both feature 4K video, the a6500 was one of the earlier models for this resolution, and that shows. The a6700 now brings you 4K at up to 120 frames per second, and at significantly less strain to the camera. In addition to being noticeably warmer after the exact same set of tests, the a6500 also dims the LCD when in 4K, often leading to improperly exposed shots. This is no longer a problem with the a6700, which also adds a significantly higher bitrate and, more importantly, bit depth to your 4K recordings. Take a look at these side-by-side comparisons. You'll notice a significant improvement in color reproduction and shadow detail in the newer model. And, in case it matters to you, you now also have the ability to shoot up to 240 frames per second in 1080p. On the software side, I guess we can start by mentioning the much faster startup time. I can't overstate what a convenience this is when we see it in newer products. There are also a lot of changes with the newer menu system, but the main thing I find worth mentioning is the changes to log. Instead of in the list of picture profiles where it was traditionally found, the menu system now has a dedicated function for applying log profiles to your footage. This probably comes a little late for Sony users who will now have to readjust. Overall though, this placement makes more sense and is more in line with current industry standards. In a side-by-side comparison at the same settings, the a6700 definitely shows more dynamic range when using S-Log, where especially the highlights retain more data. Color is a little more confident as well, and when you stretch it, you can clearly see less bleed from the newer model. Each of these cameras features in-body image stabilization, or IBIS, with 5-axis shake compensation. This has always worked really well on my a6500 for shooting moving shots from one standing position, especially when paired with an OSS lens. But to really see the differences, I went out and performed some walking tests. You can definitely tell that the a6500 is making some corrections here, though we might have to say that the a6700 does a better job while using less crop to do it. But the difference gets exaggerated when you switch to the new active stabilization mode on the a6700. This is clearly a software-enhanced stabilization. It crops more to give us cleaner motion, though it still has these odd little snaps. But that's not the end of it. In this mode, the camera also records data from an internal gyroscope, which can be used by Sony's Catalyst Browse software to give us even better stabilization, though again at the expense of some frame width. When you compare it against Adobe's Warp stabilization software process, the Catalyst Browse gyroscope-assisted output may not be quite as smooth, but it does it without the weird watery distortion. That's definitely a welcome upgrade. This makes for only the 4th Sony APS-C camera and the first in this product line to include this ability. On the topic of following a subject, intelligent object tracking has also become an essential component of modern cameras. The a6500 does feature some intelligent autofocusing, but nowhere near to the degree that the much newer a6700 does. I have been able to reliably track faces in most circumstances using the older model, but this latest release is fantastic at finding eyes and operates much quicker. The a6700 also adds a whole slew of animal and vehicle tracking built right into the camera's onboard AI. Another welcome software upgrade arrives for time-lapse geeks like me in the form of integrated interval shooting that doesn't require the loading of a slow and somewhat janky sub-application. And that brings us to the real reason why many of you came to this video, the Milky Way portion of our testing. Well, okay, maybe that's just the real reason I rented this camera, but those familiar with the channel know that I'm all about Milky Way time-lapses. So, to test each camera's ability to capture the stars, I used my 12mm Rokinon lens set to f2.0 with the exposure set to 20 seconds and the ISO set to 3200. Already you can see some differences between the two. But hold on. This is the a6500 and this is the a6700. The image from the a6500 definitely looks brighter, and the histogram sure confirms that. But how is that even possible? The newer a6700 even boasts Sony's latest backside illuminated sensor configuration, which should absolutely result in better light capture. To be honest, this result perplexed me for weeks, until I learned more about the version history of ISO exposure index standards. I know, this is getting a little bit wordy, but stick with me. Have you ever wondered how manufacturers determine their ISO values? The International Organization of Standards, where the word ISO comes from, publishes a set of methodologies for brands to follow when calibrating and labeling their products. We've talked in previous videos here about how messy that gets in practice, but you would think that coming from the same brand, you should be getting a uniform threshold. Well, apparently, the standards received a major update to publish procedures in 2019, while the a6500 was released in 2016 and thereby was subject to the techniques that date all the way back to 2006. In layman's terms, the way ISO is labeled changed between the release of these two camera models. This certainly does complicate how we look at these shootouts. While this additional element of consideration will necessarily change how we evaluate future and past comparisons, on this channel I have always tried to talk about detail and noise on a granular level, zooming in to make the ultimate determination. So the most practical thing we can do for this specific head-to-head is to raise the exposure until the histograms match, and then get in close to see what we can determine. At about 2/3 of a stop brighter, they now match on the graph, but they are not equal. When you get in close, a clear detail winner emerges for the newer a6700, far superior star sharpness and fidelity, and noticeably more detail in the gas clouds. But that's not all. We also see much better foreground color fidelity from the newer model. That typical green we have seen from some Sony sensors when struggling to capture darker areas is making a strong showing here with the a6500. And that only becomes more exaggerated as you raise the exposure value. The a6700 has more detail, less noise, and way better color reproduction in the darkest areas of the scene. Just for the sake of comparison, let's really push it with a second image, this time taken with a 24mm full-frame lens and at an ISO value of 25,600. This is not a reasonable ISO value to shoot with, but just look at the difference here. With only 5 seconds of capture time, the a6700 is still getting us some very accurate color data, while the older a6500 has collapsed into greens again. With only a slightly higher second native ISO value on the newer model, this must be a credit to the quantum efficiency of that new backside illuminated sensor configuration. Out of curiosity, why don't we bring in another camera with a BSI sensor? Well, it's no surprise that the a7S III is a bit brighter, and we know that these two cameras are calibrated to the same ISO standard. If we look close, there is definitely less noise from the a7S III at this high ISO value, but the crop sensor of the a6700 is actually resulting in better detail up close. This is no surprise if you watched my previous Sony camera shootout, but these results have me wondering how the a6700 might stack up against the a7R5. While raw star detail might still be out of reach, I think that this latest APS-C model is probably better at handling ISO color noise than the R model. But I'm guessing there may not be too many consumers trying to decide between those two, so let's get back to the original question. Neither of the two APS-C cameras is going to get us a time-lapse quite like the full-frame A7S III, but the results are still serviceable from either one, though greatly improved with this later model. For Milky Way landscapes, you'd have to choose the a6700, chalking up yet another point for this newest APS-C model. The a6500 has been an awesome travel-sized camera. This thing has accompanied me to the mountaintops of every western state. When I bought it, I was personally looking for a few things in a new camera: fast, reliable autofocus, impressive low-light capability, and convincingly smooth in-body stabilization. On each of those counts, it's clear that the a6700 brings meaningful improvements to the product line. When you consider that it comes at essentially the exact same launch price, you have to conclude that it is well worth the upgrade from the 2016 model. It's worth mentioning that while the a7 IV is a fairly affordable full-frame option, that's still $1,000 more for the step up. And as we've seen here today, these APS-C cameras just keep getting better and better, making them an increasingly practical and budget-friendly option for first-time buyers and professionals alike. But which APS-C cameras would you like to see reviewed in a future video? Let me know in the comments. I'm sure we'll have plenty more models to talk about this year, so thanks for watching and I'll see you on the next one.